The evidence that I've seen on this seems to suggest that animal cruelty imagery and messages are amongst the most impactful when it comes to dietary change. You also get more substantial dietary change, so going vegan rather than going flexitarian, and also longer lasting. Some people have the idea that they could just kind of wake up in a good mood and get rid of factory farming one day. It's not so. They're actually constrained by the preferences of all of us individual consumers and voters. It is reassuring to know that actually when you point these things out to people, almost nobody says this is acceptable. Probably about half of my male friends from home have gone vegetarian now, which was awesome.
Even lads can change.
Even lads can change, yeah, absolutely.
Good afternoon, Chris. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Jamie. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Yeah, and it's great to talk again. You're one of the rare guests that I've actually spoken to before the interview. So it was great to talk to you and Aditi about your work and how that might fit in with the themes of what we're doing here with this Sentientism Worldview Project too. And your focus, of course, is very much on social science research, and your main topic of study is that weird thing called the human being. So I'm expecting you to have perfect answers to how you can solve all the world's problems for us in the course of this conversation.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Yeah, we'll see. But it's great to have you and some of your team as listeners too to the Sentientism podcast. So you guys know this already, but I guess it's a series of conversations about what I think of as the most important philosophical questions, and the deepest ones, the questions of what's real and how should we understand reality and the universe, but just as importantly, the questions of what and who matters, the questions of ethics, how to live a good life, and what does that even mean? And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this really pluralistic, very broad, but still quite radical worldview called sentientism that I summarize as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when we're thinking about the what's real question, it suggests we should take a naturalistic approach, engaging honestly with the reality to try and understand it, hopefully with a healthy dose of humility. That's the evidence and reason part. And when it comes to the ethical question, it's very broad and pluralistic, but says, look, at least every sentient being should count in our moral consideration, should warrant compassion, should warrant some care, should warrant rights maybe, or so hence the evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But I'm lucky in these conversations to talk to a broad range of fascinating people, some of whom agree and some of whom don't. So it'll be interesting to know how your views fit or don't as we go through your own philosophical journey and how that influences your work now. But I should stop blathering on and give you a chance before we go into those big questions to introduce yourself and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're very aligned in terms of how we see a lot of those topics. So I'm looking forward to getting into it. And thanks again for having me on. I'm honored to be joining quite a star-studded guest list that you have had. Very impressive stuff.
I've been very lucky, yeah, and it's great to add you to the list too. So.
Hey, winners make their own luck. That's what I say. Yeah, well, no, it's fantastic to be here talking to you, and thanks again for having me on. I'm Chris Bryant. I'm Director of Bryant Research. We provide affordable research and social science services, policy analysis, really anything in terms of how we get people to behave differently. And we do that work across meat reduction nonprofits, alternative protein companies, and others that are trying to move our food system away from animals and towards alternatives. Of course, industrial animal farming, one of the biggest, utility sinks that we can point towards, and a big net negative in that sense, as you've aligned with your thoughts on compassion, morality as well, which we can get into more. But we've been very lucky to work with a lot of alternative protein companies, so meat alternatives, dairy alternatives, plant-based, as well as cell-cultivated meat companies. It's been fantastic to be able to work with so many of them. And then also, yeah, as I mentioned, with animal non-profits as well. So looking at how we can use survey research and social experiments to try and maximize the impact of their outreach and campaigns as well. And we're really trying to apply that empirical evidence to the ethical question in many ways as to how we can get people eating fewer animals.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And your research that I've seen seems to cover a very broad variety of different topics, but they all coalesce around that central mission, I guess, of shifting our food and wider production systems to a more ethical basis that doesn't involve sentient beings, frankly. So, yeah, and we'll dig into much of that later on, because we'll come back to it, but there's a sense that quite a lot of the science and philosophy that we discuss here, the epistemology and the ethics, is quite straightforward and pretty obvious to many people. But the dark heart of the problem really is in the social science space you work on, the human psychology, sociology, economics, politics, and how to actually get those things to shift in the right direction. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to understand how those aspects of human society are either enablers or blockers for trying to make the world a better place in our final question.
Yeah, for sure. No, there is a real broad range of social topics that touch this issue, and lots of levers for us to reach for, to try and pull, to make a difference for animals. Yeah, we do a lot of marketing, market research for alternative proteins, and then also looking at policy things. What kind of policy solutions might be not just effective in reducing animal production consumption, but also politically feasible, right? What are going to be things that people are willing to vote for, or at least not vote against? So there's really a range of things that we can try to do to move things in that direction, and we've tried to be, take quite a broad view on all of these different areas, and how we can make an impact in each of them.
Thank you. Well, let's start with the first of those big philosophical questions, and in a sense, it's an interesting mix of your own sort of personal journey thinking this stuff through, but then how does it apply to your work? And the first of those big questions is the question of what's real and epistemology, and how do we go about understanding the world? And in most of these conversations, an interesting starting point is the question of whether someone grew up originally in quite a scientific, naturalistic, maybe atheistic context, or one that was maybe more spiritual or religious or supernaturally minded, and how that side of their thinking shifted over time. It's not the only epistemological question, but quite often it's an interesting and socially resonant place to start. So I don't know if you like to talk us through sort of that side of your story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess seems quite a natural place to start in terms of thinking about what matters and what's real. I guess that people who become interested in these things often tend to start that interest at quite an early stage. And it seems to interestingly coincide with a lot of the kind of times of life where you're trying to work out how to orient yourself around things that you're interacting with in the world. I think like a lot of British people, I grew up in a house which is sort of nominally religious, really. Sang hymns in school assemblies, but didn't go to church, that sort of thing. Yeah, we were kind of, vaguely Christian, as I suppose a lot of people in the UK are. But I don't think I ever really was that kind of bought in either way on that. And eventually came to be an atheist, I suppose. And I suppose quite a common thing to happen at that stage is that people can think, well, what is the answer then? What does matter, if not the kind of religious framework that I have been brought up in or vaguely aware of? What can I look to for some sort of meaning or outcome like that? And I think for me, I started to get interested in philosophy and philosophical questions at university in my undergraduate at Exeter. Yeah, it was remarkable. I think I at some point realized that philosophy was the thing that I had been talking about in terms of some of these questions as to what matters and so on. And yeah, I had a friend who was studying philosophy and went along to a few of their lectures, and that was where where it first occurred to me that I ought to become a vegetarian. So I pursued that. Around the same time, I suppose, this must have been around 2014 or 15, I came across effective altruism as well, which I think, in my experience, it seems to be something that is either immediately compelling and appealing, and people think, well, of course we should be doing it like this, or just completely uninteresting. And some people do seem to be not particularly interested in questions of what's moral or anything like that. But for those people who are and find this kind of way of thinking compelling, I think it's an incredibly powerful tool. So that is, a large part of what you talk about in terms of applying empirical evidence to altruistic intentions and trying to come up with the best ways of doing good, achieving positive outcomes in terms of utility, or however you want to think of that, given limited resources. And how can we go about doing that? So that was kind of
that's the path.
Yeah, the things which underpinned my subsequent interest in all things meat reduction related.
Yeah, thank you. So, and the transition, I guess, from a sort of default Christian but not particularly engaged to atheism, sounds like it wasn't a particularly traumatic or difficult experience for you. It was just something you worked through, and that instead of turning to nihilism or relativism or something, it was actually the field of philosophy and later effective altruism that helped to address some of those questions of meaning and purpose, and that sometimes people struggle with. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah, I would say so. I had a good go at hedonism in the interim there. There's another outcome one can reach, right? If nothing matters, then crack open the booze.
That's a fair point. That's another philosophy we haven't spent much time on here. But yeah. So and as you move to that conclusion about atheism, if we just stick to the epistemology stuff for a bit, again, it's only one question in epistemology and ontology: is there a God or not? How do we think about that? But there are so many others. And one of the interesting things as I've been working on this project is coming to the realization that just because someone's an atheist doesn't mean they actually have a naturalistic epistemology more broadly. There may be many areas where either they believe in other aspects of the supernatural, or they believe things about the natural world that are fundamentally extremely likely to be wrong because they haven't actually got a very good quality epistemology at all. It just so happens that they happen to be, I think, right about atheism. It doesn't mean they're right about anything else. As you went through that shift to atheism, have there been any other aspects of the way you think about reality that either have held on to some sort of sense of the supernatural or the transcendent, or as you became an atheist, did that come along with just a sort of broadly naturalistic, this is what it is, let's engage with the evidence and work out the answers worldview?
I think I've always been tended towards a naturalistic view, certainly in terms of epistemology. I'm quite willing to be wrong about things, I think is one piece of that. I think a lot of people, if you haven't really thought about epistemology or kind of, thought about thinking and, how to work things out about the world, you kind of have your assumptions that you don't necessarily realize are assumptions. And so I'm always trying to kind of think of ways that I might be wrong, or what would be true if I was right about this or wrong about this. And actually on some of the sort of positions that I've come to take, they often start as an idea based on what I think I know. I reckon that this is true. And if it seems to be something that is not in line with received wisdom, then what I'll do is to try to kind of crash test the idea and ask people who ought to know about that if I'm barking up the right tree, basically. And then sometimes it's a simple case of saying, well, I've spoken to someone who knows what they're talking about now, and actually I can see why I was wrong on this. Or more than once, I've had the experience of going to ask somebody, look, I'm sure this is a silly question. Everyone seems to think X, but I think Y. And sometimes I'll get the response of saying, yeah, I think you're right, actually, or, I hadn't thought about it like that, or some sort of affirmation, right? A big thing that I had this recently was on processed foods, which we've written about on Bryant Research recently. And that is something that at the moment seems to be just a given, that everybody is on board with thinking that processed foods are unhealthy. And I think that probably started from just like a differing intuition to what most people appear to have. I can kind of understand that a lot of people will have the intuition to use the heuristic of, processed means unhealthy and natural means healthy. But I guess I didn't really have that intuition myself. And I thought, is this actually necessarily the case? Is there not something more complicated going on, right? And I spoke to some people, some nutritionists and so on, and found that, actually it's not quite that simple as to say all processed things are unhealthy. And actually, we don't have a very good definition of what counts as processed or not in many cases. So things like that, where you get the opportunity to speak to people who also know what they're talking about and kind of, stress test your ideas about a given proposition. I think I've been very lucky to have those opportunities and be in a position to falsify beliefs and move off them if that's the path, or to think, oh, there's something here.
Yeah, thank you. So it sounds like certainly a broadly naturalistic approach, and it's interesting because that is a combination of both the empirical gathering evidence, testing, doing research, but as you've also pointed out, also knowing who to talk to and who to trust and who are the good sources and authorities. And I think that's as much an important part of epistemology as putting on a lab coat and running a double-blind trial as well. So. And you touched on quite an interesting example there, because in this field that you're working on of trying to drive this transition, there's a lot of social science work that focuses on values and ethics and even aesthetics and choices. And we'll come back to some of those things later. But sometimes it feels like the epistemological stuff, the belief formation, is maybe neglected or isn't focused on as much. So I'm interested in how you think about how humans in general go about forming beliefs and how they get things wrong or get things right. Nutrition is one example. The belief that animal agriculture is humane and sustainable is another. That's not a values mistake. That's not saying I don't care. That's a factual error about an actual situation. So how do you think about how, the social science of how humans go about belief formation, and how does that play into your work? How important is people understanding reality accurately?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think one thing which vegetarians and vegans are going to be pretty sensitive to is people having cognitive dissonance and displaying motivated reasoning. We've all had the experience of speaking to a meat eater, and they have the conclusion that they want to reach, that they don't need to stop eating meat, and now they're going to work backwards and subscribe to some premises which are going to get them to that conclusion, which of course is completely backwards to if you were kind of just approaching it neutrally and trying to come up with the correct answer. So I think even if you have not read the papers on this or know it by name even necessarily, people who are vegetarian and vegan have spoken to meat eaters will have had this experience and be familiar with that kind of process of like, okay, I'm kind of cottoning on that people are just going to say they believe anything in order to keep eating meat, right? And so I think vegetarians and vegans will be very sensitive to that, and rightly so. But I think there's also a piece that comes before that, which can be missed. We're familiar with sitting down with somebody and having the conversation about, should we be eating meat? Is there some sort of moral problem with eating animals and so on? And then they come up with their reasons. And that's the visible part to somebody who's having that conversation from the vegetarian or vegan side. But the invisible part comes before that and is just people not thinking about it, basically, or people not knowing about it. So when people are wrong about these things, it might be that they have an idea which is incorrect, or it might be just that they don't have an idea, they've just never thought about it. Right? So if you ask somebody, what percentage of animals do you think are on factory farms around the world? Well, people can come up with a guess, and most people tend to underestimate it. But the reality is most people have probably never really thought about that question, and just, perhaps actively avoid thinking about that, right? So there certainly is all this cognitive dissonance and motivated reasoning that comes into play when people are kind of forced to confront it. But upstream of that, there's really just ignorance, and I don't say that disparagingly. There's lots of things that I'm ignorant of, right? But people just don't know, and there's lots of things that I've never thought about, and so I think that actually represents close to 50% of people where they're just like never really given any serious thought to this. I think it's important to reach those people with just the reality and the facts, and we can get the impression that people are going to be very resistant to the reality and facts, and many people are going to be resistant, but most people just don't have access to it or have never been prompted to think about it. So I think for the most part, people tend to be wrong when you ask them to estimate things related to animal farming. they may not hold those beliefs very strongly, right? It's not like somebody strongly believes that it's only 50% of animals are factory farmed when in fact it's 90%, but they have just never thought about it before. So I think a lot of frustration is to be alleviated from the vegetarian side by kind of recognizing that and saying, look, if I'm getting to a stage with somebody where they're saying, whatever it may be, claiming to think that chickens can't feel pain, but lettuces can, or whatever. For some people, that's progress, right? Because now they're at least having to do the mental gymnastics, whereas before it just never occurred to them to do that. So yeah, I think we're very imperfect when it comes to forming our beliefs, but for the most part, that's just for lack of having thought about it, I think. And I think there's the fact that so few people have thought about it should be some kind of weird hope for vegetarians and vegans who, might prompt those thoughts in the future.
Yeah. And I think it helps in at least a couple of ways. One, I think can remind us to be compassionate as we're engaging with other people because of, the epistemic context they come from, right? And the things they've learned and what they were taught as normal and the things that they, like you say, are just ignorant of or not aware of, as well as cognitive failings and so on, which we all have. But I think it can also help us think about, interventions and types of change we want to make to address those deep underlying problems as well. And, it really is because of the nature of, I guess, our wider society and the content of education curricula and the presentation and marketing of animal agriculture. Those are many of the reasons why people have this default ignorance or avoidance or, even false beliefs before we move into these things. And there can be a tendency just to jump to, and I feel this strongly myself, is, pin down the individual and beat them over the head with facts, right? And, that, I guess, is not always the most effective way of changing someone's mind. Given this broader context, we've got to actually engage in fixing that broader context as well to help. So.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think people in alternative proteins often will see it as part of the solution, where you'll have what people talk about push and pull factors. Confusingly, push and pull both going in the same direction in this model. You have push factors away from animal products, so that's talking about the animal cruelty and talking about the environmental impact. Why should I eat less meat, right? Push away from animal products. And then the pull factors are towards the alternatives. So you have to have high quality alternatives that are affordable, that are not unhealthy, that are appealing to people. So you have that kind of push and pull of both sides. And I think really for a long time we didn't have very good pull factors, so we didn't have very appealing alternatives to offer to people, basically. And that increases the motivation behind the motivated reasoning when you think, if I lose this argument, I have to go vegan and I'll only be able to eat beans. Right? But if you can still have burgers and chicken nuggets and everything else, well, I'm not very motivated to try to defend this view anymore. And so I'm not likely to find myself subscribing to some of those beliefs that people kind of come up with to justify the decisions if they feel, actually, I've not got much to lose if I choose something else. So you have those kind of push and pull factors, but there's definitely, broader societal forces in terms of just social norms and expectations of others, and the social representations that we come to form of vegetarians and of farming and what that looks like. And those are kind of socially communicated and reproduced. You can think of it as like what other people think of this thing, right? So not what do I think of vegetarians, but what do I think everyone else thinks of vegetarians. So there's an important piece there. But there's lots to trying to get somebody to change, and it is a large change that we're asking people to make. If we're talking about going vegetarian or vegan, we need to have those pull factors in place in terms of good alternatives. We also need to try and address some of what happens at the societal level in terms of, what norms are we promoting and so on. But I think we do also need to not shy away from the push factors. I've written a bit about how animal cruelty content is actually pretty impactful in terms of getting people to change their eating habits. There seems to be a bit of a myth that you shouldn't talk about animal cruelty because it will put people off and it will give them dissonance, and then they'll shut down. The evidence that I've seen on this seems to suggest that animal cruelty imagery and messages are amongst the most impactful when it comes to dietary change, right? You get a higher percentage of people saying that they'll change their diet compared to like an environmental or a health message, say. You also get more substantial dietary change, so going vegan rather than going flexitarian, and also longer lasting. So I think there are good reasons to not shy away from the animal cruelty argument. But at the same time, because it is unpleasant to experience, it's one that people will try to avoid where possible. So I'm, thinking more and more about what kind of formats can we put this message where it's just quite hard to avoid. And I do think that with respect to cognitive dissonance, some people sometimes have the idea of you don't want people to have cognitive dissonance because then they won't agree with you. I think we should see it as you actually do want people to have cognitive dissonance. You want to give them enough dissonance that they feel uncomfortable enough that now they feel motivated to go and do something about it. You have to tell people, if you show people that there is a reason to change. And so I do think that, inviting people to collide with the reality of animal farming as frequently and graphically as we can get away with, I think is an important part of the solution.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. And I think the content around animal exploitation and animal cruelty is a really interesting place where the epistemology and the ethics come together, right? Because there's the facts of the matter, right? These things happen. These are standard farming processes. They are experienced in this way by these sentient beings. These are epistemological facts about reality that link very directly and viscerally into an ethical concern that we'll come on to talking about this, that most humans at least have to some degree for non-humans. And again, there is some sort of hope there about how we can draw that link. So it's interesting that that's the way you see the research, that can actually be a compelling angle to work on. So let's move on to the second question, which we've touched on already, which is about what matters, but also who matters, the questions of ethics. And often in these conversations, it's interesting because you talked about it already as you moved away from sort of default Christian worldview that was sort of a background thing to atheism. There's a question of, okay, what does matter? And you've already talked about your journey of exploring philosophy. And I guess a couple of things that you've prefigured already was you talked about utility, and you talked about effective altruism, which, as I understand it, in simple terms, is just the idea that we should be altruistic and we should try and do that as well and as much as possible, right? We should be effective about it as well. So I'm interested, one, about, okay, is that how you see the good and the bad, the right and the wrong of ethics? Is it ultimately about utility in that sort of classical utilitarian mode? And is effective altruism the worldview or the mission that you then attach to that? Is there more you want to say about how you think about the foundations of ethics, if such things exist?
Yeah, I think so. I think utilitarianism was always the most appealing framework to me because it seems to be able to account for the scale and severity of any given suffering or well-being experienced, right? So 100 people getting shot is worse than one person getting shot. Yeah, as a matter of psychology, that's something where we tend to misfire. We don't have naturally the ability to scale our moral concern appropriately for those in those kind of situations. You've probably come across this. A nice study that demonstrates this with the birds in oil. Do you know the birds in oil study?
No.
Well, they have. So what it is, it's an experiment where participants pay to take part, and then they can forego some amount of their payment to give to a charity. And they're told about some birds which have been affected by an oil spill. And I think there's 3 conditions in the original study where they have, in one condition, they say, how much of your reward money would you be willing to donate to save 200 birds from this oil spill? And then the second condition, how much would you be willing to donate to save 2,000 birds? And then the third condition, 20,000 birds. Right, so we've got 100 times more birds than the first condition. And of course, if people were behaving rationally in that way, they'd be giving 100 times as much. But the punchline of that is there's no difference between the 3 conditions when you're telling people they can save 200 or 20,000 birds. We just don't have the wetware to scale our moral consideration appropriately to the actual size of the matter at hand.
Yeah, sometimes called, is it scope neglect? Is that one term for it?
That's right. Yeah. Scope neglect. Yeah.
I'd heard of a similar experiment, and again, I'll probably get it wrong, but I think the upshot was that people were shown a picture of a girl clearly suffering distress in a refugee camp, and were willing to donate one amount of money, and then if they were shown a similar photo where brother was standing next to her, the actual donation amount dropped, and then if it was a larger group, it's a similar sort of dynamic where, I guess given our evolved human brains, we struggle to cope with scale beyond what I guess we evolved to deal with. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's a similar thing going on. And of course, that has implications for animal advocates because, many of us might want to say things like it's 56 billion, the latest number I heard, in terms of, I guess that's land animals that we kill for food each year. But that is, if I were doing animal advocacy posters, that's not something that I want to be putting on my poster. I'm not going to get 56 billion times the emotional reaction. And in fact, it might go the other way, that people think, well, look, if this number's so vast, then my contribution can't possibly be worth all that much, right? So it's kind of like a drop in the ocean way of looking at it.
Come to see your own choices as irrelevant in the scale of it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So that kind of building in the scale and the severity, that was quite appealing to me about utilitarianism. And it occurred to me more recently, I'm not sure if that's actually exclusive to utilitarianism, because even if you take a deontological approach, you can talk about more rights violations, right, or rights being violated to a greater degree. So it seems like you could still get that in the deontological version. So I guess that said, I don't have all that much to kind of choose between them. But I think, and then of course, like the third pillar of that is virtue ethics, about becoming a good person and so on. And I think an interesting way to get from that to the meta-ethical level, where it's more like, well, does anything matter, right? What does right and wrong mean, right? Before we start talking about utilitarianism and everything, some people will say, well, look, there's doesn't seem to be any way of validating moral position. There's nothing that you can point to and measure and say this is right or wrong because X, right? Unlike in empirical matters. And I think for me, it has been, first of all, of course, annoying to come across people who have that view, because you think, well, where do we go from there? But for me, it seems to be satisfying to say, well, look, we've got these three theories of normative ethics broadly, and they all have something to do with the well-being of others. We clearly have some idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about ethics. So if right and wrong mean anything, they have to have something to do with others' well-being, suffering, rights, and so on. And from there, I think we can say, well, okay, if we accept that it has something to do with not having others suffer or not violating the rights of others, you can get a lot that follows from there, just empirically, basically. Setting aside the questions of whether you can really know of anyone except you can experience, right? We could all be philosophical zombies and so on. But if we take that for a given, right, moral questions have something to do with either utility or deontology or virtue, then I don't think there's really a way to go from there to avoiding, the vegan conclusion.
There's no escape. There's no
escape.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Thank you. And I think I was lucky enough to have a conversation with Peter Singer about this topic. And one of the things we talked about was I think utilitarianism, as you've said, is one, it's quite good at breaking through that scope neglect. It sort of forces us to recognize that thousands and millions and billions really do matter. And it's also quite good at helping us break out beyond our sort of in-groups as well, because it just says, well, that's another being that has some utility in its well-being, and there's another one, and there's another one. And it doesn't matter if they're a different group of humans. And ultimately, it doesn't matter if they're not human at all, right? If they have some well-being, some interests, then, they count on the utility meter and that counts. So they're quite good at breaking across those boundaries and pushing us to a very broad moral scope. But then there are a lot of criticisms about utilitarianism, and I've spoken to many people who are quite vociferous about these criticisms, because I think there's a sense that in broadening our scope of moral concern very widely, it can sort of come with a detachment. As we sort of take a point of view of the universe that is very good at pushing us to be broadly concerned. But as we take the point of view of the universe, we're sort of losing touch with the individual sentient beings that are the ones that matter in the first place. So some people can take utilitarianism in a way that can feel quite cold and intellectual, and it's about calculating, and it's about adding, and then it becomes about offsetting, and then it becomes about and there's this sense that at some point you've forgotten the individual, suffering sentient being who ultimately is the repository of the utility, and utility cannot exist except in the context of those individual sentient beings. And that leads many people to, either adopt one of these other schools, ethical schools of thought, or something that's more pluralistic that says, well, okay, I can see those challenges and there are different approaches. But as you said, I like the approach of saying, well, morality almost by definition is something to do with whether and how we have concern for others. So, whichever school of thought you want to apply, there's still enormous common ground there about good and bad and right and wrong, whether you're a utilitarian or a virtue ethicist or a feminist care ethicist. But I don't know whether you've bumped up against or how you think about some of those pushbacks and those challenges to utilitarianism.
Yeah, I guess that that's interesting, because I don't know if there would necessarily be a conflict or a contradiction between those levels. I can see what you're saying, that a very zoomed out, intellectualized utilitarian approach can appear to be sort of cold and calculating, and certainly I'm sympathetic to somebody who might think about it that way. I think that I would always think, I tend to align with that kind of zoomed out way of thinking in the abstract. I think that, in practice, it's quite difficult to live one's life entirely aligned with that. I think that, I sometimes think when I need to go and walk my dog, my girlfriend says, come on, we're going to go and walk the dog now. And if I'm working, I'll think, I'm trying to save 1 million pigs here. Never mind walking the dog, right? It's like losing the scale. But of course, you can't really live your life in such a way. We do need to have, what a strict utilitarian might consider sort of unfair biases towards those in our family and stuff like that, just to function properly, right? I mean, what would it look like if I tried to give as much concern in reality to strangers as I did to my partner or whatever? But I think when you think about how you want the system to work overall in terms of, policy decisions, or how should we allocate health budget or whatever it may be, you probably do want some way of trying to quantify that and put it, make sure that we're maximizing whatever it is we really care about, even if that's not how it's emotionally experienced. I guess that you want your policymakers to be utilitarian, but your lover to be deontological, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it applies at different levels.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things, because in a way, some people criticize utilitarianism because they think it's, in a way, not being caring enough, right? It's too detached, it's too calculated, and it will lead some people to say, well, I'm not going to go vegan because I donate £100 a month to animal advocacy charities, and that more than offsets the suffering and death I cause. And for someone with a rights mindset, or even a care mindset, or a virtue mindset, there's like, what the hell are you doing? Right? This isn't a spreadsheet. You're taking acts that are directly harming, real individuals here, right? So in a way, it's criticised for not being caring and ethical enough. But at the same time, one of the challenges with utilitarianism, as you hinted at there, is it's also extremely demanding, right? If you follow the letter of the law of utilitarianism, some of the difficulties are that it can be super demanding, and that can be psychologically unsustainable. It can, in some cases, if you get your calculations wrong, lead to people doing terrible things for good ends, and we know where those things can lead. So it's quite interesting that utilitarianism is sort of challenged in both ways. It's not caring enough, and then sometimes it's caring too much.
Yeah, and I think I have to say I do find that way of thinking to be compelling even at that scale. So I think like when we're comparing moral systems and saying, okay, what would we come up with if we followed moral system A or moral system B on this particular question? It seems that we are always kind of more sensitive to what the negative outcome would be in either case, right? So take the example of the person who's not going to go vegan, but they are giving £100 a month to an animal charity. And they can show you that giving to this animal charity is helping more animals than would be helped if they were personally vegan. Of course, those things are not mutually exclusive, right? They could just do both.
Yeah. Which is the point Peter Singer made, was like, just do both. Yeah. And there is another alternative here.
Exactly, yeah. But I think that, let's say for the sake of argument that it was going to be one or the other. Now, I can totally relate to the indignance or the disagreement that someone might feel with the person who decided to give the money instead of going vegan. And it seems to be most in focus when we can look at it and say, well, these are the animals that you're going to kill to eat. And you're giving money to this charity over here, but, this guy's getting a knife in the throat, right? And that brings it sharply into focus and makes you think, okay, perhaps you ought to not be doing this. But then it's almost immediately like on the other side, well, if it is actually the fact that giving the money to the vegan charity is going to prevent more knives in throats, then what about those animals, right?
Yeah, so I think, why privilege one set of victims over another? Yeah,
right, exactly. Yeah, and it, kind of get back to the scope neglect thing that we mentioned as well, right? But I think if in the hypothetical world where somebody really was going to either go vegan personally or commit to some substantial donation that would save more animals, I would have to say I'd choose the latter. Just in terms of outcome, I think, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Understand it. And again, the resolution is, of course, just do both, so we don't have to worry about these difficult ethical trade-offs.
For sure.
But I think that's an important point, right? Because, again, in any ethical system, as you said earlier on, what we're trying to do is try and take the perspective of the other and imagine how things are for them. And that has to include all of those potential impacted parties, not just the ones we're necessarily more directly connected to. So, yeah, thank you.
So I think it actually may be true when we look at, so at some point animal charity evaluators had estimates published of how many animals you can save per dollar donated to their top charities. I think they've taken that down now. I don't know if they've moved away from that kind of framing of things, but it was some very good value for money number of animals can be saved per dollar donated. I think about 4 animals per dollar donated, right? 25 cents to save the life of an animal. And to get even with the number of animals that one would be not eating if one were to go vegan, it's like a pretty small donation, actually. It genuinely is a pretty small amount that one would have to donate to create the same amount of impact. I think the problem with that in practice is it's almost like a self-detonating belief, such that is true at the moment, that's true today, but if everybody came to believe that, it would stop being true, because all of those donations are contingent on somebody eating fewer animals, right? And the person who's donating is going to be more likely to care than the person who's not donating, and so on. So, it's similar to voting, right? It is actually true that if I don't vote in the next general election, it's probably not going to make a difference. The chance of my vote actually making a difference in the next general election is minuscule. And that is correct. And that is true of everyone. But it's not true of everyone, right? If we all believed that, nobody voted, then where would we be, right? So it's a similar thing where, okay, it's technically true in a narrow sense, but it's not a good belief to cultivate or a good attitude to cultivate, because then you'll have everybody giving their money and nobody being vegan, and it won't work.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's another interesting challenge that often pushed back the utilitarian, is that you're not putting enough responsibility or accountability ethically on the individual to do the right thing. And that can lead to those sorts of situations where there's an argument for futility or, there's something else that just disincentivizes people to act. And I think there's, at least a couple of responses. One is to, yes, adapt to a different type of more virtue ethics or rights-based ethics or care-based ethics that does talk about the individual more. The other one is just a more enlightened utilitarianism that says, actually, as you were pointing out, if everyone followed this path, where the hell we'd be. And actually, by taking individual actions, there's signaling you're doing, there's all sorts of other types of influence you're having. Even a utilitarian, if they fully recognize those ripples of impact, would probably come to the same conclusion anyway. So I guess there's different paths here. Before we come on off this, what matters and who matters question, you touched on this already, but as you were learning about philosophy and utilitarianism, one of the impacts there was your moral scope shifted, because I think many people would agree with this sort of common sense of view of morality is that others matter in some way, and morality is about how and whether we care about them. But one of the critical questions that's obviously central to this series of conversations and the sentientism worldview is, okay, well, who counts as one of those others? So we have all sorts of terrible problems within humanity itself about in-groups and out-groups and dehumanization and exclusionary ethics and so on. But one of the critical breakpoints is people going beyond the human as well. So I wondered if you want to tell us a little bit more about how you went through that journey to recognizing that non-humans matter, and is sentience a useful characteristic or marker that you use to set scope now, or how do you think about moral scope now?
Yeah, actually, I dare say it's the only marker. I think, yeah, if you're sentient, you matter, and if you're not, you don't. Basically, right? I mean, of course, if you're not, there's no you. But I remember getting into this with my PhD supervisor on the topic of, at the time I was a vegetarian and she was not, and I think she would often perceive the things that I was trying to argue as, this is just motivated by vegetarianism, this is some sort of departure from objectivity or something like that. And of course, one thing to say to that is, like, there is values baked into any kind of science that just in deciding what you're going to study is value laden, right? There were people in the psychology department doing work on smoking reduction, right? And I said to her, we can look at the mechanisms that we can, design the packaging or whatever else to try and get people to smoke less, but we could do that with just as much scientific rigor to try and get people to smoke more. And who's to say that one's the worthy outcome and the other's not, right? So clearly there is some sort of value judgment going on here. But then I wanted to get from, sentience is the thing that matters, or the experience of sentient beings, the thing that matters. Sentience is the thing that makes an individual matter, to, the vegetarian or the vegan conclusion with a few other leaps. And so I'm just trying to set up this first premise that mattering is a function of being sentient. And my supervisor said to me, there can be things where we consider it a moral issue, but it doesn't relate to living being, right? Like climate change, she said. We think that climate change is bad, but clearly the planet's not itself sentient. To which, of course, you say, we only care about climate change because there are things on the planet that are sentient. Right, we don't care about climate change on Mars because, as far as we know, there's nothing sentient on Mars. So there's, Mars can flood or roast or whatever, and it's not going to be any skin off anybody's nose. There has to be a nose off which to take skin before we can talk about any kind of moral consideration. So, yeah, I think that sentience, the capacity for experience, the capacity to suffer or experience well-being, is that which matters. And we can think about, animals, or we could even think about like a hypothetical human that doesn't have any sentience. And if they truly don't have any sentience, then there is no moral consideration of them, in my view, right? What does it mean to behave badly towards somebody who has no experience of that, or wouldn't even know, right? There's no suffering to be inflicted. There's no well-being to be achieved. So I think that, without sentience, clearly one doesn't matter. And I think with sentience, one does, regardless of species or race or anything else.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. And I think there's an interesting thought experiment, which is when someone says something matters or something is of value, if you keep asking, okay, well, why does that matter? And you keep asking, okay, well, why does that matter? Why does that matter? And I think the end point of those conversations is always, okay, well, then I guess in a fundamental sense, it doesn't matter. Or I think you come back to because it matters to someone, to some sentient being. And that is the end point, the reason why the experience of another sentient being matters, why their perspectives and their interests matter, is because it matters to them, and there's nowhere else to go. Whereas, as you say, with things like climate or ecocentric concerns or other instrumental concerns, they're instrumental because ultimately of their impact in some way, shape, or form on the experiences of sentient beings. So I tend to be, like you, I think, quite a strict sentientist, and almost everything comes back to sentience for me. Whereas other people, and I do keep this quite open-ended in terms of the definition of sentientism, is to say, well, look, all sentient beings should matter. And if you want to go further in your concern or care about some other aspects, some people I've talked to are interested in ideas of dignity or agency, or there are other types of things that might go beyond the sentience of a sentient being or beyond sentience. But as long as every sentient being matters seriously, I'm more worried about making sure that sentient beings don't get excluded than I am about, other entities being included. But
no, I agree with that. Yeah, there's no matter without mind to whom it matters, I suppose you could say. Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think the including is certainly more important than the excluding, right? If somebody wants to care about the well-being of a rock, then, to the extent that doesn't come into conflict with the well-being of sentient things, right? Then I don't see any reason to oppose that. But presumably, if somebody did have those kind of beliefs, at some point we would separate on what we would want to be prioritizing. And I think even with things like dignity and autonomy, to me, that still implies some subject. Even if we could talk about like historical, like destruction of historical sites and things like that, that only matters because someone knows about it or will be offended by it or has some sort of value.
Or could aesthetically appreciate it.
Exactly, yeah.
And I feel in a similar way, those ideas like autonomy, autonomy is important to the experience of a sentient being. That's why it's important. It's not important in its own right. Susanna Monzo was one of my previous guests, and she talked about dignity. And one of the interesting examples there is, okay, well, what about the dignity we ascribe to a dead body? That individual is no longer sentient, but we still ascribe dignity to it. And again, my sense is, well, it's because of their family and the friends and the rest of us around it. It's, that clump of atoms no longer, no longer cares about anything. So in a sense, we don't need to intrinsically care about them. But it doesn't mean those other considerations aren't very rich and important.
Exactly, yeah. You shouldn't kick a rock if it's my rock, and I'm going to be upset if you kick it.
Exactly.
Because there's a subject to go.
But the rock, I think, is unlikely to care either way, yeah.
Right. And I mean, even in a case where you have no, let's say there's a dead body and there's no living family or whatever else, we all know that one day we're going to be a dead body, and we're going to hope that people don't treat us in such a way. So I think there's, again, it's going to come back to some subject, having some objection.
Yeah, makes sense to me. And as you went through that process of recognizing that non-human animals mattered, again, given you're a social science researcher, it would be interesting to have you as a sort of N of one. What was your experience of, because you went vegetarian, but I think you're vegan now. What was your experience of going through those transitions like in today's society? How tough or challenging was it, psychologically, socially, practically?
Well, I think I'm a bit unusual. Although that said, I have met at least one other vegan who's had this similar experience. I was actually argued into vegetarianism first in philosophy, in one of those philosophy classes, my friend's philosophy class. Yeah, and so that was, one day the lecture was about should everyone be a vegetarian, and a big meat eater at the time, by the way. I'm a very meat loving vegan. So yeah, but I used to eat meat 3 times a day if I could, and heavy meat eater beforehand. And I think probably the context of the philosophy class was demanding that I didn't just have some sort of cognitive dissonant reaction or do some sort of motivated reasoning to kind of get around it, because I had to sit down and think about it now, and it was difficult to escape. And so then once I sort of realized that I didn't have any good reason to not be a vegetarian, it took me still probably about 1.5 years to really do anything about that. And then I was vegetarian for maybe 4 or 5 years. And then, all during that time, I knew I ought to be a vegan, really. And then eventually made the shift over. Although I have to say, we're talking about alternative proteins, I have to say I myself have only not by design, but by coincidence, I suppose, have only been vegan myself since it's been relatively a lot easier. So I have a lot of respect for anybody who's been doing it longer than, I always think of 2018 as the kind of tipping point in the UK, at least, where suddenly, you had the Greg sausage roll. That was what kicked it off, really. And now you've got McDonald's and Burger King and vegan options everywhere. But, really 10 years ago, certainly that wasn't the case at all. And if you wanted to have vegan food, it would be a mission to find it. It would probably be expensive. It wouldn't be very nice, So there was all these kind of pragmatic barriers, which really are so much reduced today. Yeah, I have a lot of respect for anybody who's, was back in the 90s going to health food shops to get their soy milk or whatever, right? I'm sure that must have been a...
I've talked to people who were in the 80s who were sort of mixing their own, soy milk from powder. Wow. And yeah, exactly.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, seriously, that makes me feel very lazy because I don't do any of that. And I suspect if that was the option, well, I'd like to say I'd still be vegan. Who knows?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're an interesting case study already, but I mean, partly because of, it's important that context and that practicality, really does matter. I mean, my journey was longer than yours. I went vegetarian when I was in my 20s. And I guess I've been probably another couple of decades to go vegan. So I'd probably echo much of what you said. You're one of those rare and wonderful people for whom an ethical argument does actually have an impact on their choices. It'll be a bit delayed, but that's an important angle too. But what did it feel like socially for you? Was it straightforward or difficult? What sort of responses did you get from family, friends, those around you? How did that feel?
Good question. One thing I've definitely noticed, and I imagine I won't be the first of your guests to say this, the people that I have known people I've met since being a vegetarian just kind of accept it. And I'm meeting this guy, he's a vegetarian, there he is. But the people I knew before doing that were much, much more skeptical and much more kind of resistant to change, right? I know you as just a normal guy. Now you're telling me you're going to be a vegan. Like, what is this, right? So I think...
Why is that, do you think? Is that because they can't understand that you've changed, or is it because it presents another level of challenge to them that someone they know has actually made a different ethical choice?
Yeah, I suspect there is a bit of that, right? It's going to prompt them to think, well, I've thought of this person as a normal guy who's quite like me, and now he's saying he's going to get vegetarian. Does that mean that I should get vegetarian? Right. Whereas if you meet someone and you know that they're a vegetarian from the off, it's not going to be, you're not going to have that moment of being like shocked that now this person's kind of doing something different, right? And I think it does present more of a challenge to them. A lot of my friends are lads, right? And so there's that kind of dimension to it. I have to say, though, a lot of my friends have come with me since that initial reaction, right? So at first it's kind of, a bit of mockery and a bit of joshing. It's all good natured, and I think I'm quite, unperturbed by that kind of thing. But since then, for about half of my male friends from home have gone vegetarian now, which was awesome. I mean, I never expected that, to be honest.
Yeah, step in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was an interesting.
Even lads can change.
Even lads can change. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that was an interesting sort of dimension of it, and I suspect that's true to some extent for all men who go vegetarian or vegan, right? It's like a little bit against the expectations. My family have always been pretty supportive of it, really. But well, actually, a lot of them got vegetarian now as well, right? My mum,
you're proving a good influence. You'll have them all vegan in no time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, my mum and my sister are pescatarian, I guess, which I have some interesting views on that we could talk about maybe. My dad, I think probably has a cheeky burger when mum's not looking, but they're eating at home together most of the time, so that's he's sort of vegetarian by default. But yeah, no, they've been very supportive, actually, I have to say. And I think the main interesting bit of the transition was in being a lad going vegetarian.
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting case study, and it cues up our final big question really well, and your work, of course, about how we can make a better future. And we talk here about all sorts of different topics, but I guess it makes sense to focus on your own mission of Bryant Research mission of this a food system transition and a product transition away from sentient animals. I guess I was going to ask you about your overall theory of change here, because it's a deeply embedded system. It hasn't been around for that long, at least in industrial terms, but it's deeply embedded in so many different cultures around the world. It has impacts from both individual psychology through to group dynamics, through to social norms, and in education and in NGOs and in corporates and in government policy. And it's sort of embedded in this really rich and powerful way. So driving change through that system is extremely hard. So I'm interested in whether you do have a sort of overarching theory of change that sort of can cue up this question of how do we make a better world?
Yeah, I think I have a few things which I think are important pieces of the puzzle, and they fit together at the sort of broad level. One thing I was very grateful to encounter in my undergraduate around the same time that I thought about going vegetarian first was some economics modules, and just knowing a little bit about supply and demand, and really just that it exists and it drives a lot of stuff, right? I'm not an economist. I can't do all the fancy econometrics type stuff, but having that understanding that when you buy things, it makes things happen in the world. It sounds very simple and kind of obvious maybe to some people, but it wasn't obvious to me, and it is not obvious, I think, to a lot of people. When you buy things, it makes things happen in the world, right? You're paying someone to do everything whenever you buy anything. When you buy a Subway sandwich, you're employing the person who works in Subway in a very small amount, and the person who drives the Subway van, and the slaughterhouse worker who kills the chicken. None of it happens without us paying for it.
Yeah, I mean, apart from the subsidies, that's where all the money comes from, right?
So, yes, and I think so it's kind of true on the political level as well. On the economic level, we buy things, we make things happen, and without us paying for it, it doesn't happen. In effective altruism and effective animal advocacy, one of the big routes forward is on institutional change. And we talk about getting governments and big companies to change their policies such that they're more pro-animal, and you'll be able to affect many more animals through those kind of routes than you would be by trying to get individual people to eat less meat. Now, I think it's important to have had that economic sort of bottom-up understanding, because it's clear to me that there is some way that we can affect institutions within a given range, but ultimately all institutions are beholden to individuals, right? So Sainsbury's can't just stop selling factory farmed products if all the consumers want cheap animal products, because they'll just go to Tesco instead, right? And the Prime Minister can't just ban factory farming if all the voters want cheap animal products, because they're just going to vote for the other party. Right, so the powerful people, the CEO of Sainsbury's and the Prime Minister of the UK, right? These are people. Some people have the idea that they could just kind of wake up in a good mood and get rid of factory farming one day. It's not so. They're actually constrained by the preferences of all of us individual consumers and voters. And if we insist on buying cheap animal products, and we insist on voting against measures which would restrict that, then nobody can do anything, right? So I think in reality, there is some kind of window within which institutions can be influenced. So you can get better or worse, supply chain policies or public policies in government that are going to be better or worse for animals. They can be within the range of what voters or consumers would accept. But ultimately, we do need to change everybody's view, right? We need to change, or maybe not everybody's view, but we need to change enough people's view that they buy and vote differently enough that we get different outcomes on the other end. Because if we are committed to buying cheap animal products and not voting to restrict that, then there will always be a politician or a food company on the other end who is, more than willing to accept our money or our vote in exchange for those demands. So there is stuff that we can do at the institutional level, but it is ultimately constrained by individuals. So I think that individual attitudes, there's no way of achieving the kind of changes that we want to see without tackling individual attitudes. And then that's interesting because individuals are of course taking a lot of their cues from institutions, right? We have some certain farming practices or animals which are illegal to farm, right? And people kind of take the cue from that. Well, that's illegal, so therefore it must be wrong. And so that's like a signal from the institution to the individuals that is going to affect our behavior. But individuals affect institutions as well, and they really are powerless. The Prime Minister, the CEO of Sainsbury's, these people are powerless to make changes that individuals won't want. Our institutions are going to reflect our values, what we are willing to pay for or vote for. And so I don't think that we can get the kind of change that we're looking for without ultimately tackling those individual attitudes. So I think there's the individual attitude piece, there's the institutions piece. And then I think alternative proteins, really the main way that I think about alternative proteins is removing the motivation from the motivated reasoning. So having, if there's nothing to lose in the conversation about whether you ought to be vegetarian, at the moment the stakes are incredibly high. If I have to go vegetarian, that's going to have serious implications for my whole life, right? And diet and family and friends and everything else. If there is nothing to lose, then there is no motivation to try to defend the meat-eating position, I think. So if alternative proteins get to the point where there really is no downside in terms of the taste and sensory experience, they're not more expensive, they're not less healthy, I don't see how one would be motivated to argue against, not eating animals.
So overall, there's this interplay between the institutional structures and the individual, and the recognition that they influence each other, but ultimately the institutional side comprises individuals and is ultimately driven by them. So that's interesting because it does bring us back to thinking about individual psychology and how individuals change in a social context. And you touched there on, there almost seem to be a couple of different schools of thought about how do we get individuals to change. And I'll caricature these unfairly, but one is ethical argument, right? Just persuade people this is wrong and get them to change. And the other one is don't talk about the ethics. Just make it fast, cheap, easy, and available for them. And then they'll do the better thing without even realizing they're doing the better thing. And the criticisms of those two caricatures, one is, okay, the ethical transformation is a nice idea, but not many people really respond, quickly enough to really change this system we have because of the epistemic context, because of the ethical context, because of the social normalization. Right? There are weird and wonderful people who are changed by ethical argument, but it's a hard and long road, right? So that's the criticism there. But the criticism of the fast, cheap, and easy route is, look, you're basically doing an ethical bypass, right? And if we're doing an ethical bypass, one that just feels a bit icky to me because, people have still got terrible ethics. I feel this on opprobrium and this need to fix that. But there's also a genuine worry that the fast, cheap, and easy thing without an ethical shift could lead to all sorts of other future horrors because people haven't really changed, right? We've just changed their context, but who knows what horrible stuff we might go on to do next. How do you think about those sort of two schools of thought? Because there was a hint there that the idea about alt proteins playing a role in removing some of the blockers isn't just about fast, cheap, and easy, but it actually might enable people to make a moral or ethical shift. How do you think about the interplay of those things?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think they're both each a reliance on the other, basically. You can have the perfect meat alternatives, but if people don't think that there's a good reason to stop eating meat, then it doesn't really matter, right? And it still needs something, even if you get to as tasty and affordable and everything else in terms of the alternatives, there still needs to be some reason to just break from your normal habits, right? Even if there's like a slightly cheaper thing available, there might not be enough to nudge you to change if in the absence of some compelling reason to think that you need to change. And likewise, in the absence of some feasible alternative which you can easily adopt, it's difficult to make progress on the ethical argument because people don't have anywhere to go to. They're going to accept that eating meat is bad and then eat beans, I guess. And for most people, I mean, again, I think it's difficult for vegetarians and vegans to understand the extent to which that is a big loss for most people, right? Most people really do. I think I've seen survey data that's like, I can't remember the percentage, but some ludicrously high percentage of men would rather go to prison than go vegetarian, right? People really like eating meat. They really, really don't want to stop eating meat. So I think you definitely need both components.
And that's one of the difficulties, I think, for anyone who's an advocate or an activist in this space or is trying to make the change happen. Because in essence, once you've gone to the position where you're personally vegan, and that's grounded in an ethical consideration and a stance that simply says that exploitation, suffering and death that is caused by these choices is just morally unacceptable and even horrific, that puts you in a position of a certain level of clarity and definitiveness that I think is important and grounding part of ethics, right? And it's how we feel about intrahuman ethics, right? There's right and wrong, and needlessly causing egregious exploitation and suffering is just awful, right? I mean, that's how we should feel. But once we feel that way, it does make it extremely hard for us to imagine the perspective of those who haven't yet made that journey, even though that's us a number of years ago. So by attaining that level of ethical clarity, we almost undermine our ability as activists to empathize with our audience because we've sort of taken such a radical step away. It's a tough balance.
When I had just gone vegetarian, I enjoyed that proximity to, my meat-eating peers in such conversations and saying, look, mate, I was eating meat last week, right? I know how you feel. And now, it's been a number of years. I, have got more distant from that and probably in some ways less empathy for the alternative position than I used to have. I think on the idea of alt proteins being some sort of ethical cheat code where you can kind of bypass the difficult moral considerations by just having something that is exactly like meat, but it's just not made of animals. I can kind of see where people are coming from with that kind of criticism, but I would think, I suppose I am utilitarian at heart because I can't help but going to the outcome, where I would think the outcome I care about isn't people having thought about the morality. It's just about them not stabbing animals.
Yeah.
Right.
What would the animals want? Do the animals want humans to be virtuous, or do the animals want not to be stabbed?
Exactly. Yeah. So if you can have, a world where we have the perfect meat alternative and now everybody stops eating animals, but, very few people have actually thought about the morality of doing that. Or alternatively, you can have a world where we don't have good meat alternatives. Still very few people have thought about the morality of eating meat. And just many more of them continue eating meat, right? The animals aren't going to know or care how many of us have wrestled with the morality of the issue, right? I think, if you can get a bypass, why not? Really, right? I don't think there's anything to lose as far as I can tell. And moreover, I kind of suspect that most people couldn't tell you why lots of things are wrong. There's all sorts of things that we used to do that would be horrendous by today's moral standards. And most people would agree with that, but most people wouldn't get there on their own, right? Again, they're kind of taking their cues from society. Well, everyone seems to think this is immoral. Okay, yeah, that does seem pretty bad. But in the absence of, we already don't do slavery or whatever other issue you could, put in the place. I'm not sure how many people would have the time or capacity or inclination to really think about it and arrive at the conclusion that we ought to not be doing it. Yeah, if you can have some sort of technological fix that means we just don't do it, I don't see any downside to that personally.
Yeah, I mean, not everybody has the luxury to sit on podcasts pontificating about this stuff, right? And the part of that is that what's normal carries overwhelming weight. in our society, in every society, I guess, for obvious reasons. And there are some philosophical objections to the alternative meat product, and some of them are to do with dignity and the association of these products with something horrific, even if they're not actually causing suffering directly. But there's a flip side to those philosophical objections, which is, whether there are also some risks to the path of alternative proteins, because some people will have such a degree of philosophical or really identitarian commitment to products made from, flesh and blood sentient animals, that those can actually be blockers to the alternative protein world. And I know you've done some interesting research about people's perceptions of these products that might help us think about how to go forward so that we don't find alternative proteins being blocked, whether that's echoes of some of the things we talked about before about processed foods versus the concern should probably be about high fat, sugar and salt rather than the processed things go through, or whether it is more of a sort of identitarian type Andrew Tate, if it's, if it's the flesh has not been ripped from the body of a suffering animal, then it's not sufficiently manly for me, right? There's some cultural stuff there, but there's also some beliefs about alt products. What's your sense about how, I guess, the alt protein world can move that agenda forward productively to actually solve this problem and avoid some of those blockers?
Yeah, so first about the some of the philosophical objections that you mentioned. I've come across some of these from vegetarian and vegans typically, who will say some version of let's say that you can nail cultivated meat, and now you can have actually meat, right? It's not come from an animal, and it's better for the environment and everything else. And they'll object to this because it contributes to the idea that animals are appropriate for us to consume, and it's offensive to the dignity of the animal, or to somehow corrupting of our relationship to other animals and so on. Again, I would be drawn to the outcomes, and I would be thinking, like, how offended would an animal's dignity have to be before it's as bad as the alternative? Right. And I think the same in terms of, like, maybe this will get me in trouble, some vegetarian and vegan campaigning in other cultures. Right, you get the thing every year where there's the dog meat festival in China, and that's a great cause of dissonance for people in the West. Now, I think it's perfectly fine to say people in China ought not to eat dogs. Some people will object to this and say, like, that's some kind of moral imperialism, right? And who are you to say this and that about their culture, and so on. Again, I would be in the position of thinking, like, just how offended would someone have to be before it's as bad as killing 10 million dogs a year? Pretty offended, right? I don't think I'm ever going to offend anyone that much. So I guess I'm very pragmatic in terms of those kind of outcomes, and I'm not really sympathetic, honestly, to those kind of arguments for that reason. Yeah, so one interesting thing that we see when we're looking at alternative proteins, I think that cultivated meat is going to be a great opportunity to overcome some of these blockers that we've had with plant-based. Plant-based meats are still seen for the most part as they've tried hard not to be seen as vegetarian products, but in many cases they are seen that way and consumed as such. And I think the issue with that is that, to the extent that people think this is a vegetarian product, they think this is for vegetarians, and if I'm not a vegetarian, it's not for me, and therefore they fail to displace demand for meat.
It's driven from their sense of identity as a vegan or not a vegan, and that's what drives the product choice, rather than which is the better product based on anything, really. It's like, it is an identitarian choice.
Yeah, exactly. And I think and I hope that the Andrew Tates of the world are few and far between in terms of people who are actually committed to it's like upside down utilitarianism, isn't it? It's like, I must cause as much suffering as possible. So I'd hope that those kind of people are few and far between.
I wonder if people like him are actually doing really good things for the vegan cause, because
maybe
ultimately it's presenting quite a stark binary choice, right? You can either go for might makes right sort of ethics or compassionate ethics, and who would want to be on his side? There are some, but hopefully not too many.
Yeah, well, that's interesting you said that, actually, because I sometimes think about that in terms of like some of these arguments on the vegetarian and vegan side that I think are kind of unhelpful ideas to promote. Like one example of this is, vegans being mean to or disparaging towards vegetarians, right? Saying, oh, you guys aren't, hypocritical, not doing enough, and so on. I sometimes think if I was double agent, right? If I was like a meat industry shill, kind of posing as someone in the vegan movement, what kind of ideas would I be looking to promote that are ostensibly vegan things, but in fact are going to help my meat company sales? And I think that's one of them. And I think another one is this, like some of the ideas about sort of anti-meat alternative beliefs that, again, there seems to be like reasonably common in vegetarian and vegans. And I think the people at the meat companies are rubbing their hands when we're getting into those kind of fights. So yeah, there's some kind of version of that. I think the interesting thing with cultivated meat, most vegetarians and vegans are not interested in eating it. Most of them do not want to eat it. And there's a higher rate of meat eaters that say that they would eat it compared to vegetarians. And I think that's a really good thing because it avoids being perceived as a vegetarian product. It goes after the bigger market from a business perspective, and it goes after the market, from an ethical perspective, it goes after the market that matters. It doesn't really matter to me if vegetarians start eating cultivated meat or not because they're already not eating meat from animals. So I only care about selling it to meat eaters and displacing demand for the animal product. So yeah, I think cell cultivated meat is going to level up our ability to displace demand for animals using alternative proteins, and a lot of that is coming from the divergence from plant-based products in terms of being seen. It's not for vegetarians, right?
That makes sense. Thank you. Again, you touched on this really challenging balance between maintaining the ethical clarity and drive, but not allowing that to undermine our campaign to get more people to agree with us. Right? There is a danger that ethical clarity can end up feeling like a barrier that pushes others away, and I guess that's one of the eternal challenges in this movement and this cause. And there are also risks of the flip side where there's a sense that if we're too open and we're too welcome and we're too incremental, that we lose the clarity and we end up in some sort of welfarist dead end where in 20 or 30 years we've got an even bigger industrial animal agriculture system that we've now convinced ourselves is humane and sustainable and everyone's happy. So there is a difficult balance there, but I think that there has to be some way of maintaining the ethical clarity, but finding ways to bring people to join us rather than, as you say, pushing them away and doing the meat shill's job for them. Because I think there are also people that work the other way around that probably are actually paid by the meat industry or are, anti-vegan, carnivore trolls on Twitter who, again, I think are working against their own agenda because if you look at the stuff they talk about and the things they read, that's not an aspiration that most humans really want to follow along. So maybe the two sides are working against each other. Yeah, I think that's it. Maybe there's secret agents on both sides working against.
For sure, yeah. No, I'm totally agree with that. And you need to keep some sort of sense of ethical clarity. I think you said it best, right? You need to not lose sight of what the point of this is, right? You could say, you don't have to do anything to be called a vegan, and now we can call everyone a vegan, right? But then, of course, we've lost the point of what we were doing in the first place. So you want to have some more broad appeal. I basically try to encourage people proportionally to how much they've done, and in the case of a vegetarian or a flexitarian, there's no problem with saying well done for doing what you've done, and on the other hand, that you could be doing more as well. So yeah, I think that would be the approach there. But yeah, I think on the it is worth encouraging us all to be mindful of what ideas we're promoting and how. When you think about that potential of the double agents, yeah, it's an interesting way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think that perspective can cut through a lot of this, as you say, is whether you think of it as thinking of the outcomes or whether you think of it as reminding ourselves of the perspectives of the beings we're trying to help, the victims of these processes. if they could understand what's going on, what would they want us to do? I think that can help draw us through some of these challenges sometimes, and to remember that most of the people involved in this movement are ultimately trying to get to the same place, even though we might disagree viciously on how to get there.
Absolutely. And I think that's the killer argument in many ways. And I if you see vegans go on daytime TV and stuff like that, sometimes they'll have an activist on and they'll have Piers Morgan try and catch them off guard and that kind of thing. The best responses to all these things, they're always kind of like, never mind what I might have said in the past that's controversial, whatever. It doesn't matter. Think about the animals. That's all that I'm talking about here. And they don't know or care what I may have said in the past or whatever else, right? I think that is, bringing it back to that focus is important.
Yeah, I mean, veganism isn't about vegans.
Absolutely.
And whereas anyone who's against veganism makes it about the vegans, that's the attack and the challenge. Partly because sometimes vegans are quite easy to attack, but also because it's a really easy way of avoiding talking about the non-human animals, right? It's a really easy way of, you talk about the messenger instead of the message, because you don't really want to engage with the message, because in your heart of hearts, you know the reality.
You know that, right? Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that some in the vegetarian and vegan community would do well to remember that as well. This isn't my quote. I think it might be Matt Ruby's book, where it says some people see veganism as a social movement and others see it as a social club. Right. And a social movement, people want there to be more vegans because they care about the outcomes for the animals, and the social club people don't necessarily, because they quite like being part of an exclusive club and so on. So, and it's down to all of us to try and kind of monitor ourselves, and we all have those kind of tendencies, right? Sometimes it is nice to feel a bit superior or whatever. So it is on all of us to be self-monitoring in that way and say, is the way that I'm engaging with this what the animals will benefit from?
Yeah, thank you. Now, one thing that I think runs through this conversation and some of your research is this sense that, yes, we do need to make it easier for things to shift systemically and in terms of product choice and availability, but there is still a sort of core belief that human ethics can be serious about this topic and can understand it, can engage with it, can go in a positive direction. Right? You haven't given up on human ethics, and therefore you need to make it fast, cheap, and easy. You believe that that human ethical core, that capacity to care about non-humans, is there. And one of the pieces of research that you did recently that I thought was very impactful is the one where you talked about standard farming processes and what people think of those processes when those processes are explained to them. And these aren't factory farming processes. These are processes that exist in basically any animal farm, even the supposedly friendliest organic grass-fed free range, family farm as well. I don't know if it's worth just touching on that briefly, on how that research played out and what the findings were. Because again, I took some real reassurance there that whether people in practical terms agree with this or not, in theory, they pretty much already do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So the research that we're talking about is on people's perceptions of various common animal farming practices in the UK. So these are all widely practiced things, and we asked people whether they thought each of these practices were acceptable or not acceptable or don't know. Fortunately, very few people said don't know, which I was pleased to see. You never know how many might disappear into the don't know category when you offer it. But no, we had between 70 and I think about up to 95% on some of these practices were saying it's unacceptable. And for me, I thought this was quite an important thing to establish in the absence of some objective thing to point to with respect to morality and say, this is wrong because it violates this principle. Sometimes what you're left with, and, if you speak to kind of moral anti-realists, sometimes what you're left with is like some sort of appeal to popularity and just saying some version of like, well, most people would think this is wrong. And that's kind of all you can say. That's all like moral statements will cash out with, just like, is this in line with most people's intuitions or not? And so in this case, we were talking about, do you think it's acceptable to be cutting the teeth off of newborn piglets or keeping pigs in cages that are small enough that they can't turn around for weeks on end, or killing newborn chicks gassing them if they're male and won't lay eggs. And in each case, we've got, around 90% of people saying, no, that's not acceptable. And of course, 90% of people are not vegetarians or vegans. So most of the people saying that are also paying for it. They probably don't know in a lot of cases, right? People are ignorant by design or otherwise of a lot of the grim stuff that goes on. But in principle, when most people do know about this, it's, we're not in a minority to think there's something very wrong happening here. It is reassuring to know that actually when you point these things out to people, almost nobody says this is acceptable. So, I agree. That was quite reassuring. The research is called Acceptability of Common Farming Practices. You can find it on the Bryant Research website. I think it's useful in those kind of situations where you can end up talking to someone and saying, well, look, this, and this happens. And if you do need that extra piece of saying, look, most people already disagree with this in principle, then that's where you can find that. Yeah, we're reassured to find that most people are agreeing, and now impatient for them to do something about it.
And we need to help them. Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Thank you. And maybe a good way to wrap up this question is to come back to the topic of effective altruism, which you mentioned as a sort of a framework that you find valuable. And in a sense, it's sort of hard to disagree with the top line of effective altruism of trying to do the most good and using evidence and reason to guide how we choose to do that. It seems pretty sort of obvious, who could argue with being altruistic and who could argue with being effective. But there are, many criticisms of how the movement actually works. Some of the individuals within it, some of the organizations, the culture within it. And I've been lucky to interview quite a few of the chapter authors of a book called The Good It Promises, the Harm It Does, which is specifically focused on effective altruism in the animal space and criticizing it and challenging it and say, look, we've got some issues here. And it's well worth a read. And I can point you at some of the interviews I've done with the chapter authors too. And I won't be able to do justice to it here. But there are some themes of criticism. Some echo what we talked about with utilitarianism before, because while many effective altruists, as I understand it, aren't utilitarians, there's quite a strong overlap between the two. So these ideas about demandingness and means and ends and offsetting and sort of cold calculating approaches is one thing that some people challenge, in that they have a preference for more of a virtue ethics or a rights-based approach or a care-based approach, which does, bring us back to individuals as agents and individuals as moral patients and how we engage and show compassion in those relations rather than in a sort of disconnected systemic way. So there's something there about, this cold and dispassionate view from nowhere versus a personally engaged, ethically plugged in style and approach. So there's something about that. But there are also some broader challenges, I guess, about the levers we pull, the change levers we pull. So one of the senses of these criticisms is that effective altruism is quite focused on the fast, cheap and easy thing. It's quite focused on the sort of economic and the corporate ways of interacting. It's quite focused on alternative products. And when it comes to the agriculture spaces themselves, it's focused on large scale stuff, corporate campaigns, a welfarist approach, an incrementalist approach that, again, for some of the critics, seems to have lost a connection with the visceral, horrific experiences of the victims and just seems to be treating it in a sort of disconnected, systemic sense. So I'm not going to ask you to sort of necessarily respond to all of that, but it's interesting to explore that flavor of challenge, because in a way, what we've talked about, I think, hints at some of the possible resolutions where I think you have a sympathy with much of the effective altruist approach of, influencing corporates through individual behavior and alternative products and recognizing the economic realities and so on. But at the same time, you are still drawing it back to that individual ethical imperative and a focus on the moral patience we're concerned for as well. But I don't know whether you've got a sense, I don't know if you've come across any of those sort of criticisms of effective altruism, whether you've got a sense of whether effective altruism as a movement has the ability to take those criticisms on board and adapt and adjust, or whether it is a sort of neoliberal individual consumption choices drive the corporations, the market will sort it out approach, as opposed to something that recognizes individuals and ethics and policies and the role of the state. And
no, yeah, that's interesting. I think so. I would hope yes that effective altruism can respond or adapt to those criticisms. I think I would see it as a similar and I imagine most effective altruists would agree. I would see it as a similar endeavor to scientific inquiry, where it's a case of saying maybe we have got something wrong here, right? It's always important to be saying it's possible that we've missed something. It's possible that we're wrong about something, and if so, we can update our view to account for that. Without more familiarity of the specific criticisms, I think it sounds similar to some of the criticisms that you mentioned of utilitarianism, where it's kind of at some level it seems to come down to kind of taste or what something might seem intuitively objectionable about approaching charity in such a way or altruism in such a way. So, for example, I can think of one example of this, and I'm sure this, probably this isn't one of the proper criticisms of effective altruism that you're mentioning, but something that might be similar. In terms of giving money to charity, I've come across people who will say some version of, look, it's easy to just throw money at the problem. Just give to charity and then don't think about it. Right, I've given my money to charity. I don't need to do anything else now. Right, that's like an easy solution. And if you really cared about the issue, you would put in some more effort towards it. Right. Well, I would think I care about the outcome, and if the outcome is best served by paying some professionals to work towards the outcome, as it is in lots of cases in my life, then that's what I'll do, right? If I was going to get the bus into town, somebody could say, it's very, very easy and convenient for you to pay the bus driver, isn't it? If you really cared about going to town, you'd walk yourself. Well, I mean, I care about getting to town, and here's an option where I'm able to do it much, much more quickly and easily, right? So again, maybe it just comes down to taste or like sensibilities, which might be irreconcilable.
I think there's a combination of two things. One is, I think, different schools of moral philosophy. So it is the utilitarianism thing versus a care ethic or a virtue ethic or a deontological ethic. So that's one distinction, whereas the sense that effective altruism is very utilitarian, and most of these criticisms, I think, are coming from those other schools of moral philosophy. And there's also, and this correlates but doesn't match up perfectly, just the classic political discussion about the role of the market versus the role of the state. Whereas there are some people who are like, consumers, corporates, the market will shift this thing. And other people are like, rules, regulations, state policy, legislation, implementation, enforcement, and that needs to be driven by a democratic process and the will of the people and so on. So I think there's probably a combination of those two things, and they do seem to correlate. The people who are more focused on we need a clearer, stronger role of the state also seem to be more in favor of a virtue ethics or a care ethics or a deontological approach, whereas the people, and again, there's probably some research on these correlations more generally, who take a more utilitarian approach tend to be a little bit more comfortable with this sort of consumer and corporates and, and work it through the market mechanism. So it's a combination of those two challenges, I think.
Well, okay, that's interesting. That's interesting context stuff. I mean, I think that with markets and with political systems, we are pretty much stuck with both. That the market is going to be doing something, regardless of whether or not we can understand it or like it. Right? People are going to be buying and selling goods and services, and that's all that is. So I don't know that there's really a way that we can get away from that. And honestly, I would tend to see both through the prism of what affects the outcomes in either case. And I think in that case, they actually have a pretty similar answer. They are both reflecting what we as individuals want. Companies are only able to sell things that we want to buy. Politicians are only able to do things that we want to vote for. Both of these are, large kind of abstracted ways of translating individuals' preferences and priorities into outcomes in the world. One via what we're willing to buy and the other via what we're willing to vote for. But ultimately, both are going to play a role in really any system. Both are, for better or worse, reflections of what people on aggregate want. And unfortunately, at the moment, we want cheap animal products.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you. And I think those debates and clashes will continue, and so they should, right? How are we going to work out the best ways forward unless we're arguing about this sort of stuff? But I think as long as the guiding light remains the perspectives of the sentient beings we're trying to help here, hopefully that can be a sort of North Star that all of the different groups and approaches and philosophies can bear in mind as we're trying to work.
I think so. And I think I'm sure you found this as well. I count myself lucky every day to be working in this world, because genuinely everyone you work with who's on this mission is an extremely pleasant person, right? Like unusually high in agreeableness and just willingness to help each other, and willingness to have good quality disagreements as well. I think I'm very confident that certainly people in effective animal advocacy, to the extent that we have disagreements, usually it's just like an interesting process of saying, okay, I wonder what beliefs we have that differ, that lead us to different views on this, and I wonder which of us is right, and I might be wrong, and so on. So it's generally like a very enjoyable experience to have those disagreements in my experience. So yeah, I count myself lucky to work in this world.
Yeah, and if we layer onto that the research you've done that shows that even the default human has a latent concern for non-human animals and the way they're treated, maybe we can drive change pretty fast. I mean, overall, how optimistic do you feel about how quickly could we drive some proper large-scale change in these systems if we're looking 10, 20, 30, 50 years out? What's your intuitive sense about some really big radical change? Is it sort of there's this latent positive ethic that's just sort of waiting to be unplugged if we have the right social context and product, or is this a vicious, long-term, entrenched identitarian cultural battle that will be extremely hard to shift things?
A bit of both, basically.
Yeah.
Right? I think that on the one hand, there's a version of the world where the sort of the push and pull factors work in nice harmony with each other, so that we get slightly better animal product alternatives, and then we get slightly more people willing to give up animal products, and then we get an increased sense of the social norm is shifting. Being a meat eater in a world of 10% vegetarians, it's a very different proposition for being a meat eater in a world of 50% vegetarians or 90% vegetarians, right? So I think that will kind of speed itself up as it goes along, hopefully. On the other hand, there are very powerful and well-resourced organizations that have a vested interest in not saying goodbye to the current system, and that is quite the force to be reckoned with. And I think that another thing that alternative proteins gives us is a revenue-generating arm of the animal movement, right? If it was just all non-profits and people doing it from the good of their hearts, we're going to be pretty limited in how much cash we've got to spend on billboards or whatever else. Whereas if we are selling products that people want to buy and are going to go to supermarkets and hand over their cash for, regardless of their, or sort of independently of their moral convictions, then hey, we've got a revenue generating arm, which is exactly, of course, what the meat industry has. And then you sort of unlock some more resources to put towards the conventional advocacy side of things. So I do think that those push and pull factors can work quite well in concert with each other. And part of the challenge in the near future will be helping to build an off-ramp for animal agriculture, and to have alternatives for people who work in animal farming, and a way forward to a world without animal products. And part of that, I think, has to be embracing change from the McDonald's of the world. People sometimes say, is it good that McDonald's have a vegan burger now? Shouldn't we be going to the vegan burger place? I say, well, look, McDonald's is still going to exist in 100 years probably, right? So either they're going to be selling vegan burgers or they're going to be selling animals. So I think, we have to embrace that kind of change as it comes. And if we're not willing to reward corporates where they do make changes, then they're not going to be incentivized to do it either. So it's potentially a slow and painful progress, but we'll get there.
Helping the industry itself transform, again, it does feel a bit difficult with the corporations given their role in the systems at the moment. But ultimately, they have to be given some better way forward. And the same is true of individual animal farmers as well, and initiatives such as transformation, where there's a bunch of different NGOs around the world helping individual farmers find a different business model and a different way forward that isn't exploitative. I think those are the types of things we're going to need to scale up very quickly, not just practically, but also as part of the argument. Show that this can actually be done, right? And it is happening. So get on board.
Absolutely, yeah. Because on the political side, that is something that one runs into quite forcefully, right? What happens to the animal farmers? Animal farmers are a lot of the voting base, and rural constituencies tend to have an outsized say on things and so on. So you can't ignore that problem, basically.
And that's even more critical when you move outside of countries that have industrialized their animal agriculture, because an even higher percentage of the populations are actually personally involved in animal agriculture in many cases. Yeah. Whereas in the UK, it's a tiny number. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a few things. So one thing that I, over the course of my life at some stages have struggled with is thinking, what can I actually do as an individual, like faced with these massive problems? You watch the vegan documentaries and you see the animals suffering and you just feel helpless, and you feel that you really want to do something about it, but may not have a solid idea of what that could be. I think there are three things that normal everyday people who are not working full-time in animal advocacy or anything else can do to make a real change here. One is donating to charities, right? It turns out that actually funding organizations which are specialized in doing a certain thing is a pretty effective way to get that thing done. So donating to charities, don't shy away from doing that. Don't think it's some sort of cheat code shortcut. The second is volunteering for charities. If a charity has a job that they're going to pay somebody to do, and you are able to do it for free, you are going to save them as much money as they would have paid that person, and it's as good as a donation, right? So volunteering for charities is the second thing. And there's lots of ways that you can do this in terms of online advocacy. There's coordinated online campaigns and so on. And then the third thing is helping to change people around you. Your reach as an individual is going to be lower than the reach of a company that can afford adverts and whatever else to get in front of people's faces, but it's also stronger. The people that you can reach are people that you know, and they care about what you think of them, and they don't care about what the vegan charity that paid for the billboard thinks of them necessarily. So although you can reach fewer of them, you're going to have an outsized impact on each of the people that you do reach with it. So giving to charities, volunteering for charities, and just being vocal and trying to encourage your friends and family to change, I think are three really practical and actually essential things that we need people to be doing to make this work.
Yeah, don't underestimate your individual influence and power. Well, that's been a fascinating conversation. I know I need to let you go. I could have talked to you for another couple of hours, but thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to add in? But also, how can people follow you and Bryant Research and keep up to date with what you're doing, and maybe work with you if they have a project in mind?
Yeah, well, no, I think we covered everything pretty well. I'm glad I got to plug my three things that everyone should be doing kind of at the end there. But yeah, you can, so our website is bryantresearch.co.uk, BRYANT research.co.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter, which is @Bryant_research. And on LinkedIn, which is Bryant Research. Those are kind of the platforms that we're on. But bryantresearch.co.uk is where you'll find our latest publications and so on. So I encourage people to go check that out. Hopefully there's going to be interesting and useful stuff for your own advocacy and organization. And, if you do work in a alternative protein company or an animal nonprofit, and you would find some social research of any kind useful, then do reach out to us, and we'll be happy to work with you.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Important work. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the Sentientism podcast. Thanks again, Chris. And hopefully I can count you as a celebrity sentientist.
One day. Thanks so much, Jamie. Really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure. Take care.